We now come to disruption strategy. Disruption strategy is again one of the strategies that is involves investing in execution. And so that means that you're trying to get your capabilities better than the potential competition, both in higher quality or lower cost. That has got to be your focus. So, in other words, you're competing all the time. The other aspect of disruption strategy, which is alongside execution, is of course you are competing with existing firms in the market. You're looking to set up and control the entire value chain yourself to some degree, and which is why we have associated it with this word disruption. Okay, disruption is a word that was, of course, popularized by Clay Christensen with his book, The Innovator's Dilemma, in 1997. This book was nothing to do with entrepreneurial entry, but was all about why incumbent firms who are very successful might end up failing precisely because they were doing the things that made them successful in the first place. Now, Christensen had some mechanisms in mind for that, and the mechanisms in mind do inform our disruption strategy. But of course, there are other reasons why incumbent firms can fail, and they are in fact related to the architectural strategy that we've already talked about, which involves doing something completely different in terms of how you architect a value chain itself. So these are that's part of the debate, which is where this literature comes from. But what's happened is, of course, this term disruption has been taken from that and has also been made from a thing that you would normally think was bad, such as a disruptive child, to something that is good, in this case, a disruptive startup. And so many people, Christensen included, have suggested that disruption is the only way to commercialize. It's the only model to choose to commercialize a very new idea. I think we hopefully have convinced you that, in fact, it is a choice that you face, not a thing that you must do, because it comes with it its own set of value creation and value capture hypotheses that may not be true. And so we'll review those. What is a disruption strategy? Obviously, it's defined by competition, and it tends to be motivated towards rendering existing value chains obsolete. How do you do that? Well, you have to do something new to create some new customers. In other words, you don't go straight after everybody who's quite happy in the current value chain. You go at the fringes for the people who are underserved and are not happy in terms of your customer orientation. Obviously, if you're trying to disrupt, you're trying to do something new all the way down the line, and so you're trying to tend to produce new technology strategies rather than existing ones. In fact, that was something that Christensen emphasized himself in the very definition of a disruptive innovation. You're looking for an innovation, basically, he said, on a new technology strategy rather than an existing technology strategy, which he called a sustaining innovation. Sustaining innovations improve what is there. Disruptive innovations are replacing it with something completely new. In terms of the thoughts here regarding let me get rid of that little thing here regarding identity. Identity is, in this environment, is focused very much on what is called creative destruction, which of course our lab is named after, which is basically, well, you are trying to create, but part of disruption is that what is old is going to get pushed aside, so there's a destructive element to it. In terms of what you do internally, this is where the lean startup comes in. This is where that massively iterative experimentation comes in, because you've got to work out what the customer fit is in a completely new environment. In terms of your external capabilities, external orientation and strategy, you're pursuing what is called a Judo strategy. This is a strategy where you look small and timid until you pounce. Okay? Sometimes it's called the puppy dog strategy. A puppy dog strategy where you look innocent and harmless until it's too late to find that, in fact, you're Cujo. Okay, something like that. You have to think about how you leverage untapped talent and users to do what you're doing, not fall into the same traps that, or the same nodes of thinking that existing incumbent firms have. In terms of your value creation hypothesis, what you're trying to do is develop a novel, an isolated value chain. So it has to work. It has to all come together. It has to satisfy these customers and do it better than before. So it actually has to create that value. But in terms of value capture, this is where it gets all dicey. Value capture hypothesis relies on sleepy incumbents who aren't or don't end up responding. Because if they respond, they can crush you. And if they crush you, I don't care what new value chain you've developed, you will not be able to capture any value, and you'll just be end up in a hyper competitive industry, which may not be the greatest path to sustainable and successful entrepreneurial strategy. At the heart of a disruptive strategy is the technology S-curve, which we talked about before. Recall the technology S-curve is where you have effort expended initially, doesn't yield much in terms of an increase in performance, but things start to fall together, whereas a small amount of effort leads to a large improvement in performance until you reach some natural limit and these things get harder to squeeze out. The key to a disruptive strategy is that you are going to choose a new technology S-curve, so your incumbents are on this old one, and you're going to come in here and choose a new one. And the reason why that is important, because there's this window of opportunity that exists whereby the new technology actually performs much worse than the incumbent's technology. Now, the good news is if you manage to enter there and you succeed, you're on a better path to future competition. Obviously, you're going to do much better in the long run. The question is, what is this window of opportunity? Okay, I've already told you that the performance of the new technology is worse than the old technology. So why is anyone going to come for you? Well, you have to find customers that care less about performance and care more about other things. This is the essence of a disruptive innovation. And Clay Christensen identified hard disk drives as an example of where this can occur. Why? Because hard disk drives have capacity, they have speed, and other things that people measure in terms of performance. But at the same time, they can get big and energy hungry. So what you do is you find in this window of opportunity those who care less about capacity and speed, who want small and light in terms of energy consumption, and that's how you enter. And eventually you've picked this new path that the small and light can improve in performance, and you're getting the best of both worlds, and that's a sustainable competitive advantage. We've seen this sort of approach a lot of times in the past. A great example of this is Vanguard. Vanguard is now the second biggest investment management company in the world. 1.6 trillion, more than that now, under management. And what was the technology? The market there was people giving investment advice, where to put your money to get high investment returns. Well, John Bogle realized, paying attention to his finance courses, and in fact, whatever it is that these mutual funds were doing to justify their 2 to 3% per year take, wasn't very much compared to just throwing it all into an index fund and returning that money to the consumers. That's what they did. They had average returns with low fees, positioned themselves completely at odds with the existing companies, mutual funds, but they were much easier to get into, especially for smaller investors. And they ended up proving themselves out and proving themselves to have higher returns and taking over the world. In terms of choosing your customers, a good example of a company that has pursued a disruptive strategy by doing that is Salesforce. Mark Benoff, who founded Salesforce, had a great career at Oracle, and he pioneered essentially software as a service, a subscription means by able to handle Salesforce-related enterprise tasks as you're roaming about. And he emphasizes distributed computing and all those sorts of things. And we're able to come out with tools that really serviced the Salesforce clients, which were not being provided by the larger clunky enterprise software that had been coming out of the large incumbents. And that company took off as a result, and it sucks up new firms now, including some of our those founded by some of our CDL mentors. In terms of choosing your competition, just in sort of a general sense, is a great example is Warby Parker, which we write a lot more in the readings. What you may not know is in glasses, 80% of the glasses market in the world is controlled by Luxottica, who basically, you walk in there, they control all the retailers. Warby Parker had this idea, well, screw that, we'll just do this online, and we'll sell $100 per pair for instead of $400 a pair, and it's just come in with your prescription, we'll ship it to you. And they scaled quickly and were able to get significant inroads into that market, which hadn't been done before. Now, will Luxottica end up working out how to purchase these guys? I don't know. We will wait and see. In terms of choosing your organization, what you want in a disruptive strategy is a few things. First of all, you want to build capacity for lean experimentation. In terms of choosing your organization, what you want in a disruptive strategy is to build capacity for lean experimentation. Why? Because what you're doing is executing and iterating in order to provide value for customers who are currently underserved or left out of the market entirely. You also want to choose your organization's position to target an unoccupied position. This is part of the value capture hypothesis, which means you want to enter in places that would not provoke that incumbent response. So you're trying to take advantage of hidden weaknesses in firms, in established firms, and so you're a catalyst for creative destruction in the industry. And in fact, that's why it's been adopted, and in fact, Y Combinator, the entire organization, advises all of its startups effectively to pursue a startup lean strategy. Why? It's cheap. It involves on iterating rapidly, involves on hyper competitiveness. It's hard to get control. It can take longer periods of time. And so they've effectively been pursuing that. And that's important to realize. When you see companies come out of that domain, they're already pre-programmed for this one sort of strategy. Now, as you know, that's not what Test 2 Choose 1 is all about, and so there's some dangers to that. But let's face it, they have been quite successful at picking ideas that have been matched to that strategy. As I said before, there's the value creation hypothesis. Can you create value for underserved customers? Why underserved customers? Because you have to find this niche that has not been served well by incumbent firms. And then there's value capture hypothesis. Once the incumbents wake up, what happens then? What happens then? You can't just ignore it. You have to think about what it is you'll be able to build on yourself. Now, maybe the incumbent won't have an interest in crushing you because they've got a great thing going in their business and they'll just cede some space for you. But it also might mean there might be a hypothesis that they can't do it. Now, this is a dangerous one because you have to think, when is that going to occur? What's your time frame? There's a lot of things to be thought of in that process. Also, very important, and just to re-emphasize in the disruption strategy, Netflix pursued one, is coherence. You've got to get all the elements right. You've got to choose your customers. You've got to choose this new technology. You're obviously choosing your competition, and you've got to have a compatible identity. And it's all got to make sense. It's all got to make sense. If it does not fit together, you will have particular dangers because disruption strategy tends to be hyper-competitive, and so there's not much room for error. Does choosing a disruption strategy require there to be a firm to disrupt? No. Now, the reason I say that is because often people say, well, how do I come up with an idea for a startup that's going to do this? Well, look to some incumbent and see that they're doing something bad and then do it good. Look to disrupt that incumbent as your strategy. But remember that the focus here is that can be something that you're doing. It can be the way that Warby Parker expressed their business. But ultimately, a disruption strategy is about getting execution right and being able to do that. And that's the thing that's focused on. And that is something that is independent of you targeting a particular firm you want to unseat. Will incumbent firms always fail when entrepreneurs choose an effective disruption strategy? No. They will not. This is the message of my book, The Disruption Dilemma. But basically, incumbent firms have strategies to react. Now, they might be strategies that are compatible with value creation hypothesis and value capture hypothesis. The one that isn't is when they move to crush you, and they can. Microsoft was very successful in doing this against the Netscape threat in the 1990s. But they could also acquire you. Okay, and that can work out swimmingly for you, and it works out well for them as well. So you just because you are pursuing a disruption strategy does not mean that your role for success will be because incumbent firms fail. That said, you are targeting that as an outcome until such time as they wake up and maybe do a deal. Question I often get asked is Tesla pursuing a disruption strategy? It is often talked about in that regard, and the answer is probably not. Okay? And why? Because it has targeted the high end of the market. Okay? It has gone direct head-to-head with the luxury car makers in what it is doing in the car market. It is not like the Prius Prius strategy. Let's sell an expensive car to people who with lower performance to people who care about the environment. It's not doing that at all. It's pursuing a high end, so it's far more likely to be an architectural strategy. Okay, far more likely. Is Uber pursuing a disruption strategy? Well, that's an interesting one right there. Sometimes it thinks it's not, that it's going to develop a monopoly and other things like that, but it has been quite disruptive in the execution elements. Now, the issue with Uber, of course, is it also has been pursuing a lot of control elements, or things that look like control elements, in raising barriers to entry. So it's not pursuing a focused strategy. Not surprisingly, I don't care how successful you are, if you aren't focused on something, you get into trouble. Contrast this with Lyft, who has been focused on execution and not on control. They have had a far easier ride. Amazon is, of course, our quintessential disruption strategy, and pursued it right from the get-go with very clear execution-oriented goals, and including the lack of barriers to entry. Although it is the reason why Amazon does well is not because other people can't sell stuff online. It's because Amazon does that particularly well. So is Amazon pursuing a disruption strategy? Yes, it certainly has been in the beginning. It has elements as it's grown. It's now 20 years old, that start to diversify out of that strategy. That indicates the difference between initial strategy that you choose and how you might evolve once you become an actual successful firm. Amazon's no longer a startup, so things change for it. So don't just look at disruption as the only thing that you do forevermore.